What was like the darkest day of your certain career?
Do you intentionally want to demotivate your employees and make them leave?
I'm setting clear expectations of what it's like to work here.
The number of founders who struggle with this very specific problem, I feel like there should be a support group.
You should definitely chair a founder support group for culture fails.
If everyone's not looking in the right direction and running towards it, you're not going to get there.
Someone who's not aligning with the values is far worse than just a low performer.
They're literally going to slow down your business. Do not underestimate the amount of...
Welcome back, everyone, to What the FTE, the podcast for HR leaders who are done playing defense and ready to shape the future of work. There are people who talk about values, and then there are people who build the systems that bring them to life. Aubrey Blanche is one of those people. Aubrey doesn't just champion inclusion, she operationalizes it. From Atlassian to Culture Amp to her own consultancy, the Mathpath, she's helped some of the world's fastest growing companies scale their value. And today, we talk about the hidden assumptions baked into our org charts, the rituals that shape identity at scale, and what it really means to build a fair company. Aubrey, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. I'm so excited to be here. This is one of my favorite topics and one that I have found, especially in the kind of spicy environment where talking about equity and inclusion can be a bit polarizing. Having conversations about values is kind of my sneaky way of like sneaking the vegetables into the pasta sauce. So really excited to get into it.
I am very excited. I love the controversial stuff. So let's kick things off. You once held the title Diversity Engineer, which is something I had actually never heard of. What does it mean, and how did it shape the way you see systems and power at work?
Yeah, so I think at the company that I was at, basically they had this cult. It speaks to a lot about the culture more than my job, in the sense that they really believe that everyone could be an engineer. So before I was the diversity engineer there, I was the pros engineer because I started as a business development writer. But really, I think my systems thinking actually came from a graduate degree that I did. I dropped out of my PhD and ended up in tech. And I want to tell you, I thought it was a failure. I didn't know it was trendy in tech to do that. But I studied international security from a really structuralist lens. And so I really believe that the world is determined by systems more than it's determined by individuals. And there's a lot of research to show that things like your behavior and your personality are shaped by your environment more than just kind of what's about you. And so I was really lucky in that I was at this company, kind of classic Silicon Valley place. And I heard people saying, we're meritocracy. And my math just wasn't mathing, that I was like, this is not representative of the world. And so statistically, we can't be a meritocracy. But instead of just like sitting there, I went to leadership because I don't know where I've gotten the audacity. But I said, I could do some experiments on the recruiting pipeline and we could see if we're actually meritocracy. And instead of like getting defensive or whatever, leadership was like, yeah, we should do that. And so that actually turned into a full-time job when I said, hey, here are ways that our pipeline is broken in ways that would be expected. Here's the way we can rebuild our recruiting systems to be fair. And what was cool was the leadership was like, absolutely, that's a priority and we should do that. And so it was right before Google put out their first diversity report, and this became like a big deal in tech. But I really credit that with getting into this work because for no reason, I was so naive and like in my first job out of grad school, and someone took me seriously and said, this is a problem we want to solve because it matters.
That is a wild ride. I mean, studying security, being a pros engineer, like a business tech writer, and then getting into diversity engineering and solving this problem, like tackling this problem like an engineer. This is not a linear path that I have seen. Like the dots are like so far apart, but it makes sense when you tell the story.
It is, but I have to tell people because people are in my DMs like, I'd love to learn from your career experience, and I'm like, it is so fascinating to me that you believe I might have had a strategy. Like, I really appreciate that belief, but you are giving me far more credit than I've earned, in the sense that I have always just followed the problem I thought was interesting and then said, I can figure out how to solve this. Like whether I need to go learn something, take a class, talk to people. I just was like really motivated by the sense that like the world should be fair and like I should probably try to do something about it if I feel that strongly. And so I took a product management course. I did all these other things. And so that would be my advice to people is don't try to replicate what I did because I still kind of don't know what I did, but get really passionate about a problem and then think about a broad set of opportunities that help you work on that problem.
So would you say the problem that you were looking to solve was fairness at work?
Yeah. Yeah, I think so. And, in the work I do, that's been the through line. So my role kind of expanded far beyond DEI when I was at Culture Amp, but it never really stopped being about systemic equity. So if you think about our sustainability program is really grounded in climate equity principles, or, the Culture Amp Foundation, where I sit on the board, is really about creating greater access to fair work. And sort of access to economic opportunity. And so everything I do really centers around this idea of equity and access for folks who, don't have that at present, but I just refuse to believe that that's inevitable. And so that's kind of what I spend my time doing.
And how does that translate into outcomes for the business? What are you seeing from this?
Yeah, so to flip it around, I'm often talking to folks and they say, why should we care about this? I'm like, well, do you intentionally want to demotivate your employees and make them leave? And they're like, no. And I'm like, cool. Well, not investing in equity and inclusion is basically you making the business decision that you don't care about a subset of your employees' experience and you don't care about the replacement costs when they leave. And I think you should probably go talk to your board about that intentional strategy that you have because they may disagree with it purely on the basis of your fiduciary duty to your shareholders.
So there is a line that you can draw to operational success. I mean, you coach founders on operationalizing their values.
Yeah.
How are they getting it wrong? What's the big challenge that you're seeing?
So I think with values, founders kind of know one, sometimes we have to pull them out. But I think when founders have articulated their values, sometimes they think just articulating them or them personally living them is sufficient as they scale the business to make them real. And the reality is that just doesn't work. You have to think about your talent experience or your employee journey as a complex system that reinforces values or teaches people values across time. And if you're not being intentional in designing what those things mean, people are going to make up their own thing. And that the biggest drag there is not only that you might get some nasty behaviors that you don't want, but even if you're not seeing terrible behaviors, people without a common way of operating are going to go slower. They're literally going to slow down your business. So having that common framework, norms, systems of how to operate with each other is actually a multiplier in terms of speed and velocity of execution.
It's that old saying, culture eats strategy for breakfast.
Totally. Is you can have a brilliant strategy, but if everyone's not only looking in the right direction and running towards it, but running towards it in a way that amplify each other, that ultimately you're not going to get there.
Well, your culture also kind of needs to have a strategy to get there. It sounds like what you're saying, because I've experienced this firsthand. I live the values every day. It's why is the person on the other side of the world that works for me not aligning to the values? And it's those systems that just aren't in place. I don't know that. I know that we don't have those systems. And it's funny, you've kind of light bulb moment for me that it's that there should be really a strategy for culture if culture eats strategy for breakfast. We need to implement this to move faster.
Totally. And one of the things that I see with a lot of founders is they go why are these people, the employees at this other team, not living by the values? And I always say, how do you know that they're not living by their interpretation of the values? Because I've seen this, Culture Amp is a great example where I'll give one example. So Culture Amp is very values led, as you can imagine. And one of the values is trust others to own decisions. And the idea is our founders have a really democratic way of making decisions. So it's really not very hierarchical and top down. But we found that when we hadn't articulated the specific behaviors that undergird each value and also the shadow side behaviors that are misaligned that we don't want, some people turned trust others to own decisions in a business, trust me to own my decisions. You can't tell me what to do. And
yes.
And it would be something as like silly as the company wanted to consolidate onto like a smaller set of project management tools. And people would be resistant because they say, well, you need to trust me that I get my work done with this little tool over here, and I don't want to use the standard one. And so I say that because it's kind of silly, but at the core, we hadn't articulated that that's not what that value meant. And so they can get weaponized either maybe with poor intention, but even people with really good intentions might use a value in a way that you didn't intend because you haven't actually been clear with them about what behaviors equal living that value.
Well, it's so hard to make a value of like a couple words mean something to all people across cultures and time zones and in remote environment. I mean, even in the regular workplace, it can be impossible. I know we had a value called no assholes that I still live by. You know, one of the reasons why we want to start this business is because I want to work with only people that I love and I enjoy spending time with, and I'm privileged to be able to create an environment where I only work with people that I love and respect. And I want that for everybody else because we've all worked in those bad environments, or most of us, with those assholes. You go from a small group of people in one small place and those values are so core. And then you bring that no assholes to a broader world, it becomes, oh, no assholes means no feedback. You know, no assholes means nice, not kind. No assholes means go with the flow. No assholes means like you can be super chill. You know, no assholes means no accountability. Like there's all these things that start to like transpire from like what is, as a founder, like such a profound thing, you know, like the reason you started the business, and all of a sudden it's taken and changed in ways that aren't wrong necessarily, depending on your interpretation of what that, you know, that somewhat derogatory term that you've created as a value is. It's wild.
Totally. And I think like that no feedback piece is you have this intention for how you want people to feel at work, right? Like I can tell that from you. But at the end of the day, like you can never trust that they're actually getting it unless you're willing to ask people in a way that they feel safe answering whether that's happening. And so one of the things, obviously, you know, with Culture Amp, where I still advise them, I was a VP until May, is as a feedback company, you can imagine that they're very open about collecting it. But we get, you know, 89, 90% response rates on our engagement surveys. And to me, that's such a good sign. And it doesn't mean that they're always amazing results, right? Like sometimes we find out, oh, this really isn't working. But that is, I think, what allows the company to kind of keep its promise is not that like your culture is never really being built, because how your values manifest at different stages of a company are different in different macro environments. But if you can be clear about the behaviors that equal those values, or have a process for looking at them on a periodic basis when you have a major change to make sure that they're the right behaviors for the moment, like, and that goes back to the strategy and systematizing, is like, you don't really get to like set and forget your culture and values like a rotisserie chicken. Like it just doesn't work.
Totally. I bet if you came into Certain right now, it would be an onion of interpretation of values. You know, you'd have the early days people that have this idea of what the values are, and then you'd have, you know, people that came in 2019 and 2020 and 2021 and 2022 and 2025, you know, like then they all have a slightly different interpretation of what, you know, bold and courageous means as like a, you know, as the headline for the value. Like, you know, what is the context below that? I imagine it'd be wildly different now that we're talking about it.
Absolutely. But that's why I think also the process by which you create your values and those behaviors needs to be intentionally inclusive. So I think sometimes the way that you build the systems is just as important as the systems that get built themselves. I think both the how and the what really matter. And so, you know, involving employees in crowdsourcing, what do these values mean? What behaviors are aligned? Because you can see how much divergence is there in your culture, which both is important to inform the ultimate outcome, but it also informs your change management strategy. So if there's one value that's widely misunderstood, maybe you want to do more enablement on that. Maybe you want to spend more time on that as you roll these things out. Because like people are going to have feelings about whether their interpretation is right or not, even if they're in general like bought into the values. And so I think this very participatory, intentional strategy of how you operationalize values is really important. But I also want to be clear that it's not necessarily easy or intuitive. And most founders that have a great idea, they're building a great company, this is not their expertise. This is not the thing they have tons of practice at or the problem that they're really obsessed with. And so I think it's important that founders get support to do this, because it's not fair to just ask them to know how to do it well.
Well, that makes me feel a lot better because I have no idea where to start.
I mean, I think you start getting the values on the wall, right? The posters is that, and then you build the behaviors. And then I often say, you need to think about your employer value proposition, your recruiting process, and your performance process. Those are the 3 places where you want to embed values most. So getting your EVP clear and being really clear about the type of place it works is a really, really good sorting mechanism. So the kind of people who don't want to work in your environment just don't apply, right? That helps you weed out, but also being really thoughtful about constructing structured behavioral questions in your recruiting process that helps people tell the stories about when they've demonstrated the types of behaviors that you're looking for from someone. So it's not, what are your strengths and weaknesses? It's, tell me about a time you had to manage a trade-off. What happened? How did you approach that? And what was the ultimate outcome? If something around deliberation of decision-making is something that's important to your organization. And then you also need to have some accountability in the performance process. And the last piece where you really need to operationalize it, and this is always the least popular, but you need to be willing to put people on a PIP and fire them if they can't get in line with the values. I'm not saying if someone messes up the first time you term them, that's not how that should work. But at the end of the day, if someone is showing repeated unwillingness or just an inability to grasp the concepts, then that's telling you that they're not the right person for your kind of environment.
Well, it's toxic for both parties.
Literally.
And someone who's not aligning with the values is far worse than just a low performer that does align with the values, because they're now toxic to multiple people.
Right.
And I think you bring up a really great point there that's the hard part about any business. And how do you coach managers, both hiring managers and general managers, on how to do that if you don't have a system in place? If your managers, if you're into multiple levels, like they're going to be performance managing based on their view of the values if you don't have these systems in place or the strategy.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And I think there's a really great blog. So one of my favorite people on the internet, who's also been a mentor to me, is Kieran Snyder, who is the former CEO of Textio. So they were doing generative AI before it was cool. And but she recently wrote a blog on Nerd Processor, which is her blog, about they experimented with so many ways to do performance reviews at Textio. And basically her analysis after all of this was, you have to have reviews, and you basically need to have a system that enforces that managers do the reviews the way that you say they should, that things like training have minimal effectiveness, that you actually need to build systems that enforce these things. And so saying, how has someone lived the values? Here is a link to the specific behaviors, and then evaluating the managers on how well they did at their evaluations is actually basically the only way that, Textio found that actually got people to perform well as managers, if we assume that positive, effective reviews are a core competency of being a people leader. So anyway, that's just a fun thing, is you have to be a little bit forceful with it. You cannot trust that everyone actually has the skills to do this out the gate, or that they're capable of developing them on their own.
Well, it's sometimes hard to prioritize those things when you're moving fast under a mountain of work, and you're having to manage people, process, and probably your own work that is not managing people or process all at the same time. So, how do you, what does it look like to scale those rituals of culture and identity as a company grows? Is there...
Yeah, so scaling rituals can be really painful. And I say that just as a fair warning to founders. So rituals are often things that people have really strong emotional attachments to, and for really good reason. But sometimes the particular manifestation of a ritual outlives its usefulness. So as an example, I was working with a company where early in the days of the company, there was like a Confluence page where they listed everyone who'd ever left and their like job title and the date they left. And like that was cute when you had like 20 people, but they got to, I don't know, 600, 1,000. Like it was a large number that was far beyond when this made sense. And the leadership decided to say, like, we're going to take that page down and we're going to create some guides around how to say goodbye to your team. But like, if you're leaving 1,000-person company, the majority of the company has never met you. Like it doesn't affect them that you've left, but the people that you've worked with obviously feel affected by that. And so it was a mini meltdown. There was some mayhem in the sense that employees were really attached to having this. But when you went and sat down with people who felt really strongly, it was like, what's the purpose of this? Like, what is the underlying emotional need that is getting met by this? Because it's not actually useful to you, but your experience is real. So let's get underneath that. And it turns out that it was a way that employees saw that the leadership was transparent. So it was actually about transparency. It wasn't about this Confluence page. And so then you can have a productive conversation as a leader to say, what other types of transparency would feel in line with the values? And how can we make sure we're showing up in a way that makes you feel transparent, in a way that helps you perform in your job and be a great team member? And so we were able to solve that problem. But I share that story because I really think the leadership did the right thing, but you have to expect that there's going to be a reaction to something like that. So you need to don't do the because I told you so or because I said so. Actually explain your decision and then be willing to sit with people and take their feedback, because you might actually uncover something that will make you a better leader in the future through that process.
I wish we had this conversation when I took away our former Sertonian update, because it's like it's every company, and then you have to do your first riff, or you have a period of like a larger group of people that leave, and all of a sudden it's like, oh, you're not doing it anymore because you don't want to be transparent. It's like, no, it's like these things aren't, there's not cause and effect. It's just we don't need to publish this on a whatever periodic basis at the scale that we're at, because someone at our largest we were about 500 people,
yeah,
and that's through acquisitions and stuff like that. And it's like most people don't know the person that isn't here anymore who has gone on to do great things, but like they don't need to live forever in some not a Confluence page in our case, but like that like it's just not a ritual that we need anymore.
Yeah, exactly. And so I think you have to understand, what was the purpose of the ritual? And can you find a different way to meet that purpose at a different scale, right? So
Yeah.
and there is something important about people having a ritual of saying goodbye. Closing things off is important to people, and we can value that and respect that people want that. But is telling, 800 people that have never met you that you're going to a new job, does that actually, I would argue that has become not fit for purpose, because the purpose is that you're connected and that you're celebrated for the impact that you've had. And so I think when you tell people that, like, that's why. I can also tell you that those like going goodbye things turn into like conspiracy theory generators. That's a whole separate thing. The number of founders I come up to where like people tag it and they try to like compute their own workforce statistics and things like that are not accurate because the data is not necessarily reliable. Anyway, there's so many problems with it. And the number of founders who struggle with this very specific problem, I feel like there should be a support group.
They're definitely, you should definitely chair a founder support group for culture fails.
I think it would make a lot of founders feel better that like this stuff is crucially important, but I think people don't talk about their culture fails enough. And so we don't get to learn from other people who have made the same mistakes. Or even if you don't feel like it was a mistake, you said, how many times have you done something and, looked back and said, that could have been 20% better. Like I could have shown up better. I could have executed it better, whether that's culture or not. But I just think there's such a fear about sharing your fuck ups when it's culture in a way that I don't think actually serves leaders or employees.
It's sometimes so hard to do it in the moment. And and then there isn't that kind of I mean, I think as founders, we're so focused on like what our problem is that we're trying to solve. So some of these things, I'm sure there's countless founders, including myself, that have talked countless times about, product screw ups or pivots or, things like that. But they're, not talking about the time that you couldn't scale your bike program where every new employee got a bike. And so instead you just gave everyone the money for the bike. And then everyone got really mad that they didn't get a bike, but you couldn't get bikes. Like it just didn't happen.
That sounds like a real life story.
It may or may not be a real life story, but when you talk about like the things like that, it's like, and then how you handled it, it's like, like it was a very big deal to a lot of, I mean, I think people still today who are here at certain during that time, if you're like, what was like the darkest day of your certain career? They're like the day we got rid of the bike program. Now we went from 75 to 500. So it's like, it's 75 people in Victoria, much easier to get bikes for 75 people in Victoria. But then the pandemic made bikes like unavailable. And then you start expanding, we're in 13 countries, speaking all these languages. Like
that becomes an unmanageable supply chain problem is what that is.
Exactly. There's like a whole, I mean, supply chain inflation, but like, I mean, we got published in Inc. magazine for this bike program that was like, people joined for this bike program. It was a $500 bike. Like, it was not a big deal. It's like, why did you join certain, this killer bike program? But, it's the little things, right? It's that like little touch that just doesn't scale.
But I think that's also an example of something I have to talk about. And Culture Amp has a ton of research on this. And as you can imagine, Culture Amp like uses their own research a lot, like the HR, like the research team and the HR team and all of that. We work really closely together. And it shows that like most perks like don't do a lot. So I came into tech in the era of like everybody's got a ping pong table. It's like there's beer in the fridge and there's a ping pong table. And it turns out that like that's not actually that motivating to people, but sometimes really like unique benefits do that because it attracts the type of person who really values that very specific thing. So I get why that would be totally popular. But what I would say to founders is like paying someone fairly and making your compensation philosophy transparent is actually usually a better motivator than for folks than things like perks. So, and it doesn't necessarily mean you have to pay top of market. Building a great culture saves you money on comp in that you can put it into culture initiatives. But I find that being transparent about how pay is calculated and how it works can be a huge motivating factor for culture that's often underappreciated. So love a unique perk, but also just doing the basics of things like compensation and benefits really well can have more of an impact for something that doesn't always feel so shiny and exciting.
So I love that idea. I mean, there's a bunch of legislation that has required a lot of companies to have to provide that pay transparency. Advice for multinational organizations. We talked about this before we went live. You were in the States, you moved to Australia, and you're like, oh, I'm going to take someone said you're going to take a pay cut to move to Australia. Well, pay bands are different in different countries. So how do you start to manage, someone in Canada, this is fictional, makes way more than someone in the same band in the US, which is actually almost always the opposite. But like, why are they so different? We're both working for the same company doing the same job. Like, how do you start to think about that type of, like those types of conversations?
I think it's a philosophical question. So I think what's really important is even before you set pay bands, you actually get clear on what your compensation philosophy is. So there are companies who say, no matter where you're doing the job, that we have an entity, we'll pay you this rate. That's our rate for that job. That's actually a philosophical decision that a founder can make. So they cannot do geographic relativity. But what I think is important is not for me to tell a founder they should or shouldn't, but you should be open, be able to be direct and open with your employees that you've made that decision philosophically. So when someone says, why is my pay X? You can say, here is a list of the factors we consider when we're setting a pay band. Here is the market data that we consider about this and the way that we use that market data to form our own bands and our ideal comp ratios and things like that. So I would say that the philosophical work can be the most important in building trust with people, because it means that when they do have questions, because the reality is everybody wants more money all the time. And so one of the ways to deal with that when you aren't just made of cash, right, especially for bootstrap businesses or folks who don't have really large amounts of investor funding, is to
Or
say,
venture in general today, venture post 2021.
right, well, if you're not an AI company, then you're not getting venture
Yeah.
right now.
Yeah.
But like, I just think it's that being able to say to someone, thank you so much for coming with me. I actually feel that your compensation is fair. And the reason I feel it's fair is because this is the work that's gone into it. Here's the philosophy. Here's how we set the bands. And here's how your individual pay was calculated related to those factors that I just told you. And if you can have that conversation, which I personally believe every employee should be entitled to have, then you oftentimes can come to an agreement about the way that is. And at the end of the day, if someone says, this comp doesn't work for me, hopefully that you create a consentful relationship where if someone says, that doesn't work for me and it's what you can pay, they find an opportunity that does align with them. And that gives you an opportunity to find someone who feels like it's a fair value exchange of what you can pay and what they're offering.
So don't just float out pay bands across multiple jurisdictions without strategy.
Totally. Don't do that. I mean,
don't go founder mode on pay bands and
yeah. And like, there's different, beliefs. Like, I think there's this company Buffer that like publishes all their pay. So like, you can literally look up what they pay for everything. I think that's like radical transparency. I think that is amazing. And I like the way they run the company, I think is just really impressive. They're one of those, I don't know the founder personally. I'm just kind of an internet fangirl. But I've known folks who have worked there, and the thing about it is they come in with that expectation of transparency. So it's a very different process to go from a less transparent to a more transparent model as opposed to start transparent and stay that way. Well, I would say, like, if you're moving to a place where you do want to be more transparent, either because of regulatory requirements or just because that's how you want to run the business, do not underestimate the amount of intentional change management that you need to do that. Because pay is one of the things that's most sensitive to people about their job. And so you not only need to think about privacy issues to make sure you're not sharing someone's information without their consent, but also the way people feel about seeing other specialties or what other specialties are paid. I was chatting to a founder a couple of weeks ago who had folks some of their software engineers were really frustrated that their AI engineers were in a higher pay band than they were. And they had to sit down and say, well, this is, they pegged to a certain market rate. And that was the philosophy that they were running. And I'm certainly not a comp expert, but I can recommend some for people. But that was an example where they needed to sit down and take those people seriously and understand that their emotions are valid, even if it doesn't mean they're going to change comp or comp structure.
Well, I couldn't imagine being at Meta right now where I would see AI engineers making, $100, $250 million signing bonuses. And if I'm sitting there as like, a Meta AI engineer being like, can I quit and come back? Like, is there a revolving door opportunity here that I can, I can get one of those signing bonuses?
I mean, I would love that. I mean, it's a fancy headline. I'm sure it's vested. It's probably mostly in equity. There's a lot of caveats to that number. But yeah, I do think, and that is a strategy. There are companies like Netflix that pay top of market. And they know that, and they give people a ton of flexibility in saying, do you want cash or do you want equity? And I won't go into a rabbit hole on the ways that those types of things can create inequity. But one of the things I really respect about Netflix or companies like Amazon is that they are wildly transparent about what their culture is like. And so for some people, that works really, really well. But it also means for someone who isn't on board with the values or isn't on board with the way that you work at those companies, they can opt out. I think that the worst thing a founder can do is bullshit their EVP and sell people on something they're not going to get. Like, to me, that is openly unethical. I think there are lots of cultures that I have a lot of critique of that I would never want to be a part of, but I respect a lot more a founder who is honest about what that is than a founder who lies either to themselves or their employees about it.
I love that. I think that is absolutely critical. We had another guest, CEO of a company called Coho here in Canada, and he or his CTO are on every they interview every final candidate, and they set the expectation of what it's like to work at the company. And it's funny because usually when I get on a call to interview someone, it's almost to sell them to join the business. For them, it's not. It's like I'm setting clear expectations of what it's like to work here, and you're either in or you're not. At first, I was kind of like, so you're trying to sell them not to come to the company? And it's like, no, I'm either trying to get them to say, fuck yeah, like I'm ready to go, like let's do this, or like
This isn't
I'm not
for
ready.
me.
I'm
No,
not ready to go to battle.
and
And
that
like,
comes down to a value of like full and informed consent, is because
yeah,
you're not like, you ultimately don't win. You create huge attrition risks if you sell someone something they don't get when they join. Like, it doesn't work. People are smart. They figure this out very quickly. And so I think it's just really important, like, sell honestly, because you'll get the people that you deserve. And if you feel like you're not, maybe be better.
yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, I think it's okay to be ambitious, just you can't be misleading. You know, every company is going to have challenges, but you also have to sell the culture that you have to be clear, maybe not sell, but you have to be clear on the culture that you want and where the culture is and how it's evolving. And I think, I mean, now more than ever, that's critical because I think, you know, as we mentioned, like unless you're an AI company, you're not, you know, super flush with cash. Investor expectations of profitability are higher than ever. You know, I mean, and across the board, not just in tech. It's so. I mean, every hire I would say matters more than it has, and cultural alignment is probably the most important thing that you can have with new people because you can have the best person at the thing, but if they're not aligned with the culture, they're going to be useless to the business and actually could even be detrimental. So if you can lock that in.
Totally. And there are some things that like founders embrace as a part of their culture that I just don't get. There's like this like 9-6-6 or whatever it's called, where it's like you work 9 hours a day, 6 days a week, and half a day on Sunday or something. And the thing is, like, I'm like, oh, people think they're hardcore. And I'm like, one, you know, people with lives outside of work can't do that. But also, like, statistically speaking, you're introducing bugs into your code. You're dropping your productivity per hour. Like, there's a lot of empirical reasons why that's a terrible talent strategy. But again, if you're going to do this thing that is kind of asinine, at least be honest about it. Yeah.
Well,
For me, I'm big on transparency and consent, and then letting people be adults and make their own decisions about the kind of work life they want. Because if that appeals to someone, then, you know, who am I to judge?
9 hours a day, 6 days a week, and a half day on Sunday. I mean, talk about exclusionary. I mean, you
Right.
can't hire anyone with a family. You can't hire anyone with
A disability
a
or like
disability.
medical needs.
Yeah, exactly. You're pretty much, yeah, okay. Well, I mean, that's I mean, I feel like there's like a human rights tribunal or like some like like I feel like that's like going in the direction of unions. You know, like are we gonna have like a tech workers union somewhere? Like I really hope not. I'm not a union. I'm not a union person. Well, we can disagree on unions generally. I think it should just be common decency to support the fair and equitable work of humans and not an organization, but also like market self-regulation to me is really important as opposed to like inserting unnecessary things into systems that should self-regulate.
Totally. But I think, I mean, to like circle us back to what we talked about is, at the end of the day, in order to craft your values and then build the systems that values go into, you have to decide who you want to be, you have to both decide who you want to be and then actually be really critical and figure out if you're that thing already. Because that can, and like, you might need a therapist to help you do that. So I talk a lot about like the emotional everything when it comes to running organizations. And I think because a lot of the ways we get in our own ways, not because we're cognitively incapable of the execution, but because we don't have the appropriate amount of respect and wait for the emotional experiences that we're managing through this. So that's what I would say to founders is get really clear on what you want to be really ruthless about assessing yourself and your culture about whether you're there, and then make sure that you're building the systems that actually allow you to maintain or move toward that aspiration that you set.
I love that. Aubrey, this has been awesome. Before we go, if you could leave people with one shift in how they think about leadership, what would it be?
Oh, I would say never assume you're right. I think that when you get to the top of a hierarchy, there's actually research that shows that the part of your brain that makes you empathetic actually starts to atrophy. So power literally makes you dumber. And so I think the more that we become powerful or are in the top of a hierarchy, we have to constantly consider and remember that there are things that we're missing and that we don't know, and engage curiosity for people that don't have our experiences so that we actually show up the way we intend to as leaders.
I love it. Well, I hope that I'm not getting dumber with more success, but talk to me in a couple of years and hopefully there's a test
We'll
to
do a
see.
check-in.
That would be amazing. Well, thank you, Aubrey, for joining us. Everyone, if this episode sparked something in you, check the show notes for links for the deep dive on Aubrey's insights and for more candid conversations with the people shaping the future of work. Don't forget to like and subscribe to What the FTE. Thanks again, Aubrey. This is so much fun.
Thank you so much for having me.